Welcome to the Disaffected Podcast. I'm Joshua Slocum. Today we're going to talk about the don't diagnose phenomenon. Have you ever noticed online that when somebody describes problematic behavior or even abusive behavior from someone else, that if they offer the opinion that that person might have some personality pathology or a disorder, that you get this objection, don't diagnose? Are you a doctor? Where did you get your medical degree? We're going to talk about the don't diagnose phenomenon and what it's really about. We're also going to talk about something very important that I call the Wounded Bird Camouflage. And these are people who present a facade of victimhood and gentleness to cover up what is actually a manipulative and exploitative approach to their relationships. But first, we have to talk about one of Joe Biden's first actions in office, his signing of an executive order on discrimination based on sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity. All that and more today on Disaffected. Welcome to the show, everybody. This is episode 2. My name is Joshua Slocum, and this is Disaffected. This is a podcast that is going to talk about the role of abuse dynamics and particularly the use and the prevalence of personality disordered abuse tactics in the social justice left. And the origin of this show can be found in episode 1. But the long story short is that after a very long time of being under a spell where I could not see the reality of what was wrong with my family life, I finally realized 5 years ago that my mother has a severe personality disorder, a cluster B personality disorder. And when I realized what those were, and when I saw that there was a framework, an actual intellectual framework to understand her abusive behaviors and her confounding and irrational behaviors, it clarified basically my life in retrospect for me in a way that nothing else had. And as soon as I made that realization, I also began to see and notice that these behaviors were becoming very prominent on the social justice left. The shunning, the character attacks on people's reputations who didn't deserve it, the pathological lying, the gaslighting. And I realize there are phrases, gaslighting is one of them. There are phrases that some of you are going to be very sick of hearing. And the first reaction you're going to have is, ugh, can you not use that term? The social justice people talk about it all the time. Examples of that are gaslighting, triggering, trauma, these sorts of things. I understand your initial reaction. I have it too. But one of my goals is to help people sort out the use and the misuse of these terms, because these terms are valuable and they point to real dynamics that are actually going on. They have meaning, and they're not merely caricatured terms that are used by the overly emotional. So I want to start out with a little housekeeping. I mispronounced a word in the first episode that I had never heard spoken before. If any of you are like me and you were a voracious reader from a young age, there are a lot of words that you know full well. You know how to spell them, you know how to write with them, but you've never heard them spoken, and so then you mispronounce them. This drives me crazy when I do it, so I just need to come clean. The word is apologia, A-P-O-L-O-G-I-A, apologia. It means to apologize for, to justify. I said apologia, which sounded really stupid, but now I know better, and now you do too. Let's get right into Joe Biden's executive order. None of this should be a surprise to anyone who's been paying attention, but what I do find surprising, frankly, is how many of my liberal friends and colleagues who do seem to be surprised by this, or perhaps it's just that they're in the honeymoon period. I mean, one of my friends said, you know, we feel really, really great that Donald Trump isn't here anymore, and we just need to take a week or two to celebrate. And I understand that. I mean, I don't agree. I wasn't happy about Joe Biden being elected, but I probably wouldn't have been happy for other reasons about Trump. But this is a real problem. This isn't just lip service to the woke. This is going to affect public policy in this country, and it's dangerous. So I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. I'm just going to read the first section. If you don't know, this is the executive order on preventing and combating discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. Sounds reasonable, doesn't it? Who's against getting rid of discrimination? Who wants to see sex discrimination, right? Well, there's an awful lot that's being mashed together here to smuggle in some public policy decisions and directives that you may not agree with as much as you think if you just look at the title on the surface. So Section 1 says this, quote, every person should be treated with respect and dignity and should be able to live without fear no matter who they are or whom they love. Children should be able to learn without worrying about whether they will be denied access to the restroom, the locker room, or school sports. Adults should be able to earn a living and pursue a vocation, knowing that they will not be fired, demoted, or mistreated because of whom they go home to or because how they dress does not conform to sex-based stereotypes. People should be able to access health care and secure a roof over their heads without being subjected to sex discrimination. All persons should receive equal treatment under the law no matter what their gender identity or sexual orientation. End quote. Oh, there's an awful lot of bullshit packed in there between the lines. Let's pull some of it out. The bullshit starts, and the lie starts, with the very title. Discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. Woke people on the left want you to believe that gender identity is the same as sexual orientation. Another way of putting that is, being trans is just like being super gay, right? It's just the gayest gay. And since we don't want gay people to be discriminated against, and since we don't want women to be discriminated against, well, we wouldn't want anyone else to be discriminated against either, right? So it's all the same thing. It's not the same thing. Gender identity, it's not real. Okay, it may, in fact, be used in the medical literature, and it may show up in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, but it isn't real in the way that people think it is. Gender identity is the idea that somewhere inside a person, there is a gendered soul, if you will. Now, people will object to that, and oh, no, we're not saying souls. Yes, we are. You're not using the word, but that's the concept that you're suggesting. And the idea is that inside of you is a fundamental part of your identity that, quote, identifies as male or female, or in between, or not male and not female. They want you to think that this is a natural and universal component of the human psyche, right? That we're all born, and whether you're born male or female, we all have a sense, an inner sense of whether we're male or female. And allegedly, trans people, they say, are in this small minority where their sense of gender identity, their sense of who they are internally, subjectively as a sex, is not in concordance with the physical arrangement of their body. This is what you know as the born in the wrong body trope. And if any of you are old enough to remember how this used to get talked about in the 70s and 80s, there were a lot of transsexual guests on talk shows in the 1970s and 80s, and that's what we used to call this condition, transsexuality. It was generally a man who would claim that he felt that he was a woman so strongly inside that the only way to alleviate his psychological suffering was to go through a sex change surgery, what we now call gender reassignment surgery, or even more creepily, gender affirming surgery. So this is the born in the wrong body idea. Now, I don't know about you, but this doesn't even make sense to me on any level. I cannot conceive of a thought framework that would be able to make sense of the idea that somebody is born in the wrong body. What does that mean? How is it possible to be born? You are your body. It's this weird return to the Cartesian mind-body dualism. And it's akin to religious beliefs in a soul or a spiritual essence, right? And many people do believe this, and people are allowed to believe that. But this new religion, and that is exactly what gender identity is, this new religion requires us to believe in the existence of gendered souls, this internal essence that is essentially feminine or essentially masculine or essentially male or essentially female. This is not the same as sexual orientation, and that's one of the problems with this executive order. Trans is not being a super gay. Gay people campaigned for equal rights under the law. They wanted to be protected from being fired from their jobs because of their object of erotic attraction. They wanted to be protected under the law from being denied housing, all sorts of other things, all the way up to and including gay marriage, which the Supreme Court legalized in 2015. What we did not do was to lie to people about who we were and then require them to repeat the lie back to us on pain of being publicly tarred and feathered as a bigot. We didn't tell people that we were a different person from who we were. We didn't claim to be the opposite sex. We didn't claim that... I'm trying to even think how would you actually analogize this? We didn't claim that gay men didn't claim that we were actually women. Lesbians didn't claim that they were actually men. This is what we were fighting against. The concept of gender identity is a repudiation of what I used to think the progressive left understood. It's a repudiation of the work that we all did to get people over the idea that if you were a man, you had to act in a particular way and dress in a particular way, and if you were a woman, you had to do the same thing. These sex role stereotypes, gender identity is sex role stereotypes concretized, right? Ensouled, if you will. It's quite ridiculous when you think about it. But most people don't think about it because they hear gender identity and sexual orientation and they think this is the same thing. These people are just asking for the same things that gay people did, but they're not. Trans activists right now are trying to change the law so that what's called self-ID, self-identification, trumps the reality of sex. So you'll see many so-called trans women saying, trans women are women, trans women are women, trans women are women. There's repeated mantra. And they want that to translate into, and therefore, because I say that I'm a woman, my self-assertion controls, not an objective observer outside who can see that I'm male or female, but what I say. What I say, not what I actually am, is the reality that you have to live under. And the problem with this executive order is that it mashes up gender identity along with sexual orientation. And it also mashes in discrimination on based on sex role stereotypes, which is the classic formulation of sexist mistreatment that we're already familiar with. All of this stuff sounds really nice, doesn't it? Nobody should be living in fear, no matter who they love. Yes, we all agree with that. But we're being asked to agree to a lot more than what's apparent on the surface here. And I don't know how this is actually going to be interpreted, but I don't have a good feeling about it. I talked to a friend of mine, a feminist lawyer, who said it's an open question, but she is very worried, and many other feminists are worried that this is going to mean that federal agencies who are subject to this order, right, are going to have to do things like allow men into women's locker rooms if it's a federally funded institution or agency. They worry that this is going to apply to public schools and then it may require things like public schools allowing so-called trans boys, young females, to go into male locker rooms simply because they assert that they're men. This is already happening in some places. I mean, look at the case in Connecticut. I don't have the details in front of me, but there are a couple of young men there who call themselves trans girls, and they decided that one day they were female and they wanted to compete as females in female sports and track. And lo and behold, these males with their male physiology immediately started breaking records by a country mile over actual women. And it got so bad that a couple of the girls affected by this problem in those school districts took it to court. I'll have to go and see where that is now. But this is already happening. This is not fear-mongering. fear-mongering. It's already happening. And we're going to come back to this many, many other times. But be on the lookout for this. Question gender identity. It doesn't actually make sense. Now I want to talk about something that is going to be a theme that runs through this show. And it's something that came up 3, 4, maybe 5 years ago when I began to write on social media about my experience with my mother. And for those of you who haven't listened to the first episode, my best guess is that my mother has 2 comorbid cluster B personality disorders. And as a reminder for new listeners, because almost all of you are new, this is only show 2. Cluster B personality disorders, there are 4 of them: borderline, narcissistic, histrionic, and antisocial. Antisocial is what you know as sociopathy or psychopathy. These are known as the dramatic or erratic personality disorders, and they happen to be the kinds of character traits that you usually find in abusive parents, abusive bosses, men who batter their wives. Popular examples include sociopaths or likely sociopaths who swindle Wall Street investors out of their money. People who lack empathy. They either lack empathy completely and they really don't care about other people and they see them only as objects to be used. Or people whose access to their empathy and to their conscience is so compromised by their emotional instability that in practical terms they function as if they have no empathy. So my mother is an example of this, and it was my discovery that there was a name, an etiology, and an intellectual framework to understand her bizarre and abusive behavior that led my eyes to being open to seeing this behavior in the wider world. There's a lot of narcissism in society right now. There's a lot of emotional instability. There's a lot of histrionic behavior. Social media has been absolutely terrible for this. We've all seen it. But it has found a home more than anywhere else on the political left. And it's part of what drove me away from being a progressive and a liberal and a leftist. Because this kind of behavior has been sacralized by the left. I mean, people who exhibit these behaviors and who talk about the trauma of their everyday lives and how put upon they are, whether it's based on their race, based on their sex, based on their so-called gender identity, these people are getting paid beaucoup social bucks to have histrionic meltdowns in public and to go after the reputations and character of other people and to get them fired, to get them canceled, to get them no-platformed. These behaviors can be found on either side of the political spectrum. They are human behaviors. They're not partisan behaviors. But we are living in an era when they find their fullest expression on the political left. So, a common complaint that's leveled at people like me who notice this and who talk about it is, don't diagnose because you're not a doctor. Where are your credentials? Where did you go to medical school? Are you a psychiatrist? You can't diagnose. Stop diagnosing. Stop diagnosing. So what does this actually mean? Let's talk about what diagnosis is and what diagnosis is not first. I cannot actually diagnose anyone with a personality disorder. It's not possible for me to do that. Why? Because I'm not a doctor. I don't actually have the legal and medical authority to diagnose anyone. So even if I wanted to diagnose someone, whatever that means for you, it's not actually possible for me to do that. I can't diagnose. I can say, I suspect, or this behavior is consistent with cluster B personality traits. I can say, and you can say this too, and I'm hoping that many of you will begin to be able to see this and feel confident in what you're saying. I can say, I've seen this pattern of behavior from this person for long enough that I'm pretty convinced now that they're not just under extraordinary stress. This was not a context-dependent meltdown. This seems to be an ingrained part of their character, and it's consistent with a pattern of cluster B personality disorder behavior. I'm not making any diagnoses. I don't have the power to do that. But what's really under the don't diagnose complaint, and make a mental note, look for the don't diagnose complaint on social media. Notice what people are doing when they do it and notice what they say about it. Because what it's really about is don't connect the dots, don't see the pattern, and for God's sake, if you do see the pattern, don't you dare tell anybody. This is people telling you to close your eyes and stop connecting the dots and stop doing the normal human activity of pattern recognition. And in extreme forms, this is people telling you not to detect predators. Yes, predators. People with cluster B personality disorders are often predatory. It might be physically predatory, yes. Stalkers who go after a woman and follow her around where she moves for year after year after year, very likely cluster B, very likely sociopathic. People who, serial rapists, wife beaters, abusive parents, these people are predatory. And some of them are not physically predatory. They may be emotionally predatory. And if we have time in this episode, I'm going to give an example of that. But if not, we're going to come back to it in the next episode. Think about this. Let's remove this from the realm of cluster B and think about it in terms of just normal human observation. So don't diagnose. How would that work out if we weren't talking about personality disorders, but about something else? So imagine that you have a friend who goes into what looks to you like a depressive state from time to time. Not just once, not just after a bereavement, but many times over. Say she won't leave her bedroom, she won't shower, she won't go to work. It's difficult to reach her because when you talk to her, she's hopeless and full of despair, and she believes that she's going to be fired from her job or that her family doesn't love her. And this behavior keeps her chained up, right? She chains herself to her bedroom. She's not engaging in the world. She's not living healthfully. Can you imagine somebody saying, "Don't diagnose depression. Are you a psychiatrist? How dare you? Don't diagnose depression." I don't think you would. Think of it another way. Let's say that you have a friend who's always late, drives you up the wall, always late for friendship, dates, appointments with you, maybe even late to work all the time. And you see this pattern happening for a long, long time. And then one day, he confides to you that the reason he's often late is because he can't leave his house without checking that the stove is off and that the door is locked for perhaps 12, 15, 20, or even 50 times. Right? I have personal experience with this. I've had many psychiatric diagnoses over the years, which is no surprise for people who are raised in a deranged and psychotic environment like I was. And one of my diagnoses has been an obsessive compulsive disorder. I would be unable to go to sleep at night for about 5 hours because I had a ritualistic obsession with making sure that I went to the bathroom and urinated and fully emptied my bladder. Not trying to give you TMI here, but I don't think that's too far over the line. This would sometimes go on for 5 hours. Every 5 minutes, as I was getting ready to fall asleep, I would get up and I'd have to go to the bathroom to make sure that I had absolutely no urine at all. Other times it was an alarm clock. I was afraid that I was going to oversleep and miss my alarm clock, and so I would spend up to 5 hours every 5 minutes, and it had to be on the 5th minute. It had to be every 5 minutes. I would get up, reset the alarm clock, and try to go to sleep. You can imagine what this did to my state of mind. So I have some sympathy with this. I'm happy to tell you that these things don't have to go on forever, and I have not been that bad in quite a long time. But if you saw this in a friend, if a friend said this to you, would you be unreasonable to, quote, diagnose him with obsessive compulsive disorder, or at the very least say that he's exhibiting the traits of obsessive compulsive disorder? Most people wouldn't object to that, right? When my mother came back into my life, when I brought her back into my life at 41 years old and moved her into a house that I bought specifically for her, I bought a duplex so that she could have a place to retire in a rent-controlled situation, and I could make the bills work by renting out the second apartment at market rate. If you listen to episode 1, you'll hear a little bit more detail about what went on there. But within 2 years, I had come to a literal nervous breakdown, and I had to go to court and evict my mother because she was the same abusive woman that she'd ever been since I was a child. But I had been away from it long enough that I could see how pathological this was, and I didn't tolerate it the way I did when I was younger. When my mother's behavior started to alarm me, her irrational emotions, her outbursts, sometimes violent, throwing dishes, strong evidence that she was abusing her husband physically and emotionally, I didn't want to believe. Well, I don't know if that's the right way to say it. I didn't know what to think, but it scared the shit out of me. And my first thought was that perhaps she was going into Alzheimer's. Perhaps she was going into dementia, having cognitive decline. And I talked to people about this, and I said, I'm really concerned about my mother. I don't know what's wrong with her. She seems to just fly off the handle. It's like she's Jekyll and Hyde from one minute to the next. And I thought maybe she's got Alzheimer's. So I talked to my sister, and we convinced my mother. We convinced my mother to go see her doctor and take a cognitive test. The point of all of this is, when I discussed this with friends and when I discussed it on social media, nobody said, "Don't diagnose" to me, right? No one said, "How dare you? How dare you diagnose your mother with Alzheimer's? Are you a doctor? Are you a geriatric doctor? Where'd you go to medical school? You don't know anything about that." Nobody said that, and nobody would say that. And why wouldn't they say it? Because it isn't controversial. Because dementia is one of those things where you can't attach responsibility or blame, and personality disorders, you can and must attach responsibility and blame. That's the difference. When people object this strongly and say, "Don't diagnose," they're generally reacting to what they believe is a moral trespass that you've committed. They believe that you've committed a moral wrong because you are suggesting that somebody might have a character flaw. Somebody might have a flawed personality, and they're abusive. And they don't like that reality to be exposed. There's a couple of reasons for that, and I think there are a couple of different motivations that get people to this "don't diagnose," and they go into a tizzy. I mean, some people just got extraordinarily angry with me, and it hits a raw nerve for people. And why does it hit a raw nerve? Well, some people simply don't understand. Well, many people, most people, I'd say, simply don't understand what cluster B personality disorders are. They think that they don't. Everybody, all of you, everyone listening right now, I guarantee you, statistically, this must be true. You have had a cluster B personality disordered person in your life at some point. You may not know it because you've never heard that term before, or you don't understand it very well yet, but you have had this person in your life. You have had a boss who was all sweetness and light and smiled at you in the morning and then gave you a ridiculous review that accused you of doing things that you never did, who backstabbed you, or who made you look bad in front of supervisors higher than both of you. Some of you listening have been married to men who beat you or who molested your children. Some of you have had longtime friends that maybe you've cut contact with in middle age or later adulthood because they always seemed so needy and so clingy, and they careened from one crisis to another so many times that it was finally too much for you, and you realized it can't possibly be true that everybody Jane runs into takes advantage of her, that every job Jane's ever had was a terrible job with a terrible boss, that every boyfriend Jane ever had did her wrong, and that Jane never did anything to deserve this. If you recognize this kind of personality as somebody who's been in your life, that person is very likely to have had a cluster B personality disorder. It's not certain, But these are the behaviors and tendencies that you see in people like this. This show really is all about detecting patterns of this kind of pathological personality because it has serious effects on our public and our private life. I want to do two things. I want to bring two things to you listening. I want to give you two things. This is what I'm going to try to do during the show. Number one, I want you to know that you're not crazy. If you are noticing these things in your family, in your father, in your mother, in your husband, or your wife, I want you to know that this is real. These personality pathologies are real. The medical literature has long known them. They're serious, and although they are ostensibly treatable, the reality is that people with cluster B personality disorders almost never recover. The one exception, and it's hard to put numbers on this, borderline personality disorder, which is one of the two that I think my mother has. I think my mother has borderline and narcissistic personality disorders, and frankly, sociopathic traits. And not for nothing, but we actually have a diagnosed sociopath with borderline in my family. So this is not an off-the-cuff guess from me. It's not my mother, but she had a lot to do with this younger person in my family who is so afflicted and has afflicted the rest of us. Especially if a person is younger, a young adult has a much better chance of overcoming something like borderline personality disorder if they get the right treatment when they're young, if they're able to get into some kind of therapy that helps them to examine the cognitive distortions that go on in your mind, that cause you to behave this way and that cause you to have feelings and emotions that are not consonant with reality, and that end up creating problems rather than solving them, and cause you to believe that the problem is outside of you instead of inside of you, much better chance of being able to recover significantly to the point of remission, or not as significantly, but still with an improvement if you get them young. But the older you get, the more these traits calcify, the more they become permanent and ingrained. So statistically, most people with cluster B personality disorders are not going to change. That's important. It's very important for you to understand that because it's going to affect the decisions you make. If you think that your abusive mother, who's 50 years old, is going to suddenly come to some form of enlightenment and stop gaslighting you, stop lying to other people about you, stop accusing you of abusing her when in fact she's the one who's stealing your money to feed her drug addiction, or she's the one who's talking about you behind the back, she isn't going to change. And the husband who's been abusing you, whether he's controlling you by making you check in with him when you're with friends, if he flies off the handle anytime he hears you talking to a male colleague, this is also consistent with personality disorders, he's not going to change. This matters because pattern detection means nothing unless you make a decision after you detect the pattern. You have to make a decision to cut these people out of your life, and you have to put up firm boundaries, emotional and physical if necessary. This is not your best friend who has manic depression, what we now call bipolar, who may be extraordinarily depressed for 2 weeks and then on a manic high for 2 weeks afterwards. It's not as treatable as bipolar, even as severe as bipolar is. This isn't going to happen. This person is not going to be different from who they are. Number two, the other thing that I want to give you is the ability to see and detect this in the wider world, the way I have learned to do over the past 5 years. It's alarming. You are in for some very unpleasant surprises. You're not going to like what you see. A lot of people say to me, Jesus, this is really depressing. You're not giving me a lot of hope, Josh. Well, that's reality, right? Part of figuring out how you're going to move through the world and who you're going to do it with is about picking your battles. And this is a major arena in which you need to pick your battles carefully. I tried my entire life. I tried to love my mother back to health. It didn't work. The more I tried, the more I did for her, emotionally and financially, the worse she treated me. This is entirely consistent with cluster B pathology. When I was a little boy, my mother had a talent for picking abusive men. This is very, very common with women who have borderline personality disorder. They are vulnerable to abusive men. In fact, there's a classic archetypal dyad in the psychological literature, the male narcissist and the female borderline. It doesn't have to be male and female, but it tends to shake out that way more often than not. Women with borderline are both often emotionally abusive, but they're also vulnerable to abuse. They tend to pick, choose, attract, and kindle relationships with narcissistic or sociopathic men, and some of them get killed for it. My mother always picked dangerous men. I don't know my father. My father left when my mother was still pregnant, and I resented him for that for a long time, till a few years ago. And I can't condone the irresponsibility of two young people having unprotected sex and bringing a child into the world when they're both too young, and the man to run off to leave the woman to deal with it. But quite frankly, if my mother was anything back then like what she is now, I don't blame him for running for the hills. The next man she picked was my stepfather, the father of my brother and sister. This is not the man that I was speaking about in my recent experience, the one I both called my stepfather and her husband. I'm conflicted about this, and that comes out in my sort of fickle vocabulary. The man that my mother is with now, her husband now, is not the same man I'm referring to. My brother and sister's father, my actual stepfather from childhood, has not been in my life since I was 8 years old. He was an extremely violent man. He beat my mother many, many times. He beat me very badly, to the point sometimes where he would push my head into a concrete wall. He would slap my mother around, and she would come... She would come into my bedroom sometimes during fights and sit down on my bed to hide from him and cry. And I was terrified of him, absolutely terrified of him. And she was too, for good reason. But she stayed. And she'd come into my room. I remember one time they were having a terrible fight. He was hitting her. She was screaming. And she ran into my room and sat down on my bed. I think I was 7 years old, and she was crying and shaking. And he came storming into the room and threw a pack of Merit Ultralight 100s on the bed with her lighter next to her, and then winged a glass ashtray. And he said, "Here you go, have a nicotine fit with your son." And then he walked out of the room and closed the door. And my mother fell to pieces. And as terrified as I was of my stepfather, I was terrified of my mother too. I was terrified that she would fall apart so completely that she wouldn't be able to protect us from him at all. And she did a terrible job protecting us. She stayed with him for years. And she knew how violent he was because he did it to her and he did it to me. She would bathe me and find bruises on me that she didn't put there. And she did not kick him out until one night in 1983, I think. I woke up and she was screaming worse than I'd ever heard before. And some of these fights that they had, my mother would leave the house after one of these brutalizing fights with three small children there, left with him. She one night walked out of the house with blood coming down her face. Her glasses were broken. Her shirt was ripped open. You could see her bra. And she had blood on her. And she walked the alleyways behind our apartment complex in Fullerton, California for hours. I didn't know if she was ever going to come back. She did, and she stayed. And then one night, I could hear her screaming, stop it, you're going to kill me. And I ran out, and I think my sister was very young. I was 7, 8 years old. My sister would have been less than 5. And he was trying to kill her. She was on the couch, lying on her back, and he was on top of her with his knees pinning her arms down, and he was strangling her and hitting her. And he'd slap her, and then he'd go back to strangling her. I could hear her choking. And I don't know what made him stop. Something, thank God, did. He got off her, and it's the creepiest thing. It's hard to understand as an adult, but I couldn't understand it as a child. Nobody said anything. We kids just went back to our rooms, but I went to the bathroom later that night, and they were both just sleeping in the bed, like nothing had happened. And I know she was awake that night. I know she was terrified. I know that she had woken up to reality and that she knew he might kill her, and she had to keep her guard up. It was probably the only thing she could have done. But it never had to come to that. The signs were there for years before this, and they weren't enough to make her stop. And what he was doing to her son, me, wasn't enough to make her stop, to make her put him out. And when she finally did put him out, after that night, the next day, she changed the locks. And he camped out on our patio for 3 days, and we couldn't leave the house. I don't know whether it would have made any difference if my mother had called the police or not, but we were basically prisoners in the apartment. And after that, we moved back to upstate New York, where we came from. And a couple of years after that, she bought him a plane ticket and flew him out to upstate New York to our house so that he could see his children. When you're 10 years old and you basically are thanking God that this man who's trying to kill you and kill your mother is out of your life, and then a few years later, she invites him to come back, the feeling that you have absolutely nobody on your side and that nobody's going to help you is engulfing and overwhelming. But this is often what women with borderline personality disorder do. There is nothing that justifies that kind of violence against a woman. And this is an asymmetrical relationship between men and women. Men are physically stronger. Men are more aggressive. They are more likely to talk to you with their fists than they are to make a cutting remark. So the danger that the man is going to kill the woman in a relationship where both of them are abusers is much, much stronger than that the woman will kill the man. But still, this was not a one-sided relationship. My mother provoked some of these outbursts. That doesn't mean that he was justified in what he did, but she deliberately provoked him. She said filthy things. She accused him of things. She'd do it in front of her mother. She'd do it in front of company. She'd do it in front of the kids. And, this guy, my stepfather, major personality disorder as well, obviously. But this is a pattern that some couples get into. And as perverse as it might sound to you, each person is getting something out of this. My mother was getting something out of being abused. Something pathological, something distorted, absolutely, something dangerous. But she was getting something out of it. So, borderline personality disorder is a condition that makes a person often very abusive, but also very vulnerable. And my mother was an example of that. So that's Don't Diagnose, and that's what I want you to be able to take away from the show as it goes along. I want you to know that if you recognize this behavior in your own life, that it has a name, it has a psychological description. There are professionals who understand it. There are people like me who understand it. There's help. There is life on the other side of it. But number two, and I want to sharpen your pattern detector. I want to help you see who these people are in your life. I want you to be able to make a reasonably informed judgment and to be able to discriminate between, as I said in the last episode, a friend who's going through a rough time and somebody who has a disturbed character and a pathological personality who's unlikely to change. Because personality disordered behaviors are human behaviors. I could read you the list of diagnostic traits underneath each of the 4 cluster B personality disorders, and each one of them by itself is something that most humans have experienced or engaged in at one time in their lives or another. These are human traits. What the difference between a normal range personality and somebody who may be personality disordered it's a matter of degree, right? How many of these traits do they have as compared to, say the average person? How severe are they? How often do they occur, right? It's a matter of degree rather than a matter of categorical difference. And the degree, the fact that if somebody can be truly said to actually be diagnosed with a cluster B personality disorder, that's already severe, okay? I used the term severe cluster B personality disorders in the last show, and I realized that might be a little bit misleading. There's no such thing as a mild cluster B personality disorder as compared to a normal person. Sure, there are people who may be on the milder end of the borderline range, on the milder end of the narcissistic range. And if you get even milder still than those people, then there are people who fall out of the personality disordered range. They may be very high in certain narcissistic traits, certain histrionic traits, borderline traits, but it's not quite severe enough that you can say that their personality is disordered. But any of us can have fears of abandonment. Any of us can have a very weak ego that under stress convinces us that other people are plotting against us when it isn't true. All of these behaviors are human behaviors. But once you cross the line into full personality disorder pathology, it is already severe. And one of the ways that some people that I would describe as having borderline or histrionic traits with a big dose of narcissism end up getting their distorted emotional needs met is that they camouflage themselves. This is something that you can find in a lot of personality disordered people. Some of them are very good at covering up. They have a really good false front, a mask. You'll often hear people talk about the narcissist mask, the false self. Well, there's a mask and a false self, well, to all of us, right? All of us have a certain persona that we try to present publicly that's different from the one that we present privately. We may behave differently on social media than we do almost all of us do. I have a very wise friend who says 2 things that I cannot get them out of my head because they're such good rules of thumb. Number one, that social media itself, all of it, not just Facebook and Twitter, but all of it, has the potential to push normal people into cluster B behaviors where you'd never seen in any other context. And I've seen that for sure. And I know it's happened to me. I have been absolutely at my worst when I was a heavy social media addict and didn't know how to ration myself. This can happen to anybody. The other thing she says is that for many people, alcohol itself is a personality disorder in a bottle. And that's also true. If anybody has experience with problem drinking, it's probably going to make sense to you. But it's easy to see certain kinds of narcissists and certain kinds of antisocial or sociopaths. So, for example, Donald Trump, because I know you're all curious, I may as well tell you. I didn't vote for Biden and I didn't vote for Trump. I felt like they were two really terrible choices. Yes, I do think that Donald Trump exhibits behavior that meets the textbook definition of florid narcissistic personality disorder. You would have to come at me with an extraordinary amount of data and really tight argumentation to make me see him as a normal range personality. He didn't turn out to be the evil leader that I feared 4 years ago, though. So my thoughts have changed. Yes, I absolutely do think that he fits the profile of a narcissist. But I also don't think that he was the second coming of Hitler the way many of my former friends do. That's easy to see. It's easy to see them in movies, right? A lot of people think, oh, I don't know any of these people. They're psychopaths. And psychopaths are serial killers. And we all know that serial killers are really rare. So, like, you're just never going to run into one in real life. Oh, my sweet summer child. Not true. Most psychopaths, sociopaths, antisocials, I use those terms interchangeably. Some people don't. If you have a question, ask the person to be specific. For me, they are interchangeable. Most sociopaths are not killers. Serial killers really are rare, and murderers are rare. Many of them express their antisocial tendencies in exploitation, financial exploitation. You know, the classic sociopath CEO, or, you know, somebody like a Bernie Madoff. Sometimes you see it in surgeons. There's an astonishingly high percentage of sociopaths who are surgeons. They are not all killers. They're not all physically dangerous, right? But it's much harder for people to see a kind of personality disordered person who uses what I call the wounded bird camouflage. Think of the story Rikki Tikki Tavi. And if you're of a certain age, I'm 46. When I was a kid, and we used to have movies during lunchtime, they were actually played on a 16 millimeter film projector. Good times. Rikki Tikki Tavi, the cartoon from the 70s, was a really popular one to show. And there's a part in that where one of it's based on a Rudyard Kipling story, if any of you haven't heard of it. And it's the tale of a mongoose and some humans and a family of cobras, and the politics and the machinations that go on between them. So the animal characters are personified. There's a section of the movie where one of the cobras is trying to sneak up on the humans, and it's a very tense scene because you know what's going to happen is they're going to bite. I think it might even be a baby that they're going after, the cobra's going after. Well, there's a bird here who wants to protect the baby and protect the humans, and she fakes a broken wing. She's this small little bird, and she limps and she drags her wing on the ground, and in so doing, she lures the cobra away from the humans whom the cobra is about to strike. The wounded bird camouflage you see a lot with especially women with borderline and histrionic personality disorder traits. They affect an appearance that they are needy, clingy, tender, gentle, fragile, wouldn't hurt a fly. They cry a lot. You see these people on social media. It astonishes me to see how widespread this has become. And they cover up their capacity to be abusive by presenting as a helpless fawn who couldn't possibly hurt you if she tried, right? You've seen these people. They're constantly journaling about their pain and their trauma, how invalidated they are, how deep and unique their pain is, and no one else can ever understand it. But when you get enmeshed in a relationship with people like this, they're emotional vampires. They will text you at all hours of the day and night. They will accuse you of failing to support them well enough, whether it's through money or through likes on their Facebook or by pulling strings to get them a job interview that they're not qualified for, that you know they probably won't show up for because they're nursing a hangover or for some other reason. And they, I don't know if it's conscious, but they often present themselves, they go to great lengths to look non-threatening, right? So they speak really gently, and they use phrases that sound really warm and caring, but it's bullshit. They are emotional vampires who are sucking the energy and the lifeblood and the empathy right out of you. And if you change your mind about helping them, you watch that wounded bird come at you and claw your goddamn eyes out. I'll give you an example. We're coming up to the end of the show, but I want to give you a specific example here. I have 3 cats, so of course I have a veterinarian. And one of the vet techs, I'll call her Jen, had done a really wonderful job many times that I took my cats in. I had a cat who was diabetic that I needed to learn how to manage diabetes and injections with. And she had a real way with animals. I mean, she has a real talent, and it seems to me an actual empathy with animals. And she came to my house 2 times on very sad occasions. One of the things I love about my vet's practice is they do euthanasia as a house call. You don't have to bring kitty or doggy in to be put to death in a cold office. They will actually come to your home, and you are able to hold your animal when they put them to sleep. And she was there for 2 euthanasias that I had to do to help my old cat stop suffering. I really, really appreciated her. She was somebody who I had broken down and ugly cried in front of, while I held my cat. And, she did her job and she was very kind about it. But she also decided she was trans. And she gave herself a male name and wore the chest binders. And it wasn't until she started to get very public about the fact that she had transitioned, so to speak, that I began to see a different side of her character. She was one of those clingy and excessively needy people, constantly asking for emotional validation. Against my better judgment, I friended her on Facebook. I no longer do that with professional connections. And she would send me private messages saying, "You see me as a man, right? Josh, you see me as a man, right? Right? I'm just a guy to you, right?" Over and over and over. Really, toddler in kindergarten level emotional behavior. That is one of the features of these personality disorders. One way to describe them is arrested emotional development. That's why if you have a mother like this or a father like this, when they lose their shit, they look to you like a hormonal teenager because they are. Their psychological development literally stopped. Some of them, it stops at toddlerhood. I'm not making this up. You can go and look in the medical literature. Some of them, the emotional development seems to arrest in the teen years. And that was the case with this person. And I tried to deflect, and I tried to put her off, and I tried to be gentle, but I can't lie. And I said, Jen, you need to live the life that you need to live. It's not my life to live, and I don't want to interfere with it, and I wish you all the happiness. And I don't want you to take this personally, but I don't believe in changing sex. I can't tell you that I see you as a man because I don't. You aren't a man. And the only reason I'm saying it so directly to you, because I've tried to avoid saying it directly to you because I was afraid of hurting you, you have not given me that chance. You have come after me time after time. You are calling the question. You've called me on the carpet, and now I'm telling you the truth. So I think we need to step away from each other. I wish you well. I have no animosity toward you. But this is a boundary that you can't cross with me. And for my trouble, this person has spread rumors about me to people in the community where I live physically. in the online world. I've seen some of the things she said about me, which is very, very strange because I wouldn't be talking about her to anyone. I mean, I ended that relationship, but it didn't end for her. I'm terrible. I'm one of those TERFs, again, trans exclusionary radical feminist, which is actually really funny because if you ask a lot of feminists, some of them will say men can't be feminists, so he can't be a TERF. Whatever. But she is engaged in local politics and tried to smear my name and said I'm a bigot, that I'm dangerous. This, again, I talked about this in episode 1. They reflect their character defects back at you. They accuse you of what's wrong with them. So she said I was dangerous, I was unstable, I wanted to hurt people. I mean, just all sorts of ridiculousness. Folks, watch out. The Wounded Bird Camouflage works really, really well. And you know who it works really well on? Women. Women. This is a tactic that co-opts the maternal instinct and the nurturing reflex that is common to many women. I'm not going to get into whether or not this is biological and inborn. I don't want to have that fight, and I frankly don't care. It is an observable fact that in general, women do exhibit, in general, what we would consider a maternal or nurturing instinct. In general, men tend to do less of that and tend to be more outwardly aggressive. This is a manipulation pattern that is specifically designed. It's like a cuckoo, right? Cuckoos take advantage of the maternal instinct of other species of birds. They literally, a cuckoo will push the egg out of another bird's nest and replace that egg with a cuckoo egg and co-opt the other mother bird who will then sit and brood that egg. I mean, it's a very close analogy. This manipulation works very, very well on women because women tend to want to keep social connections. They want to mend rifts that they see between other people. They want to exercise a cooperative instinct, and that can be hijacked, and the Wounded Bird Camouflage hijacks women every single day. It's one of the reasons why you see so many women out there standing up for and tearfully applauding, quite frankly, abusive, psychopathic men who call themselves trans. You can see it in the strange phenomenon of women who become infatuated with serial killers and fall in love with them romantically and write to them in prison. I realize that's extreme, but it's in the same family of what I'm talking about. That's this week's show. I thank you for joining me, and we'll get into these topics yet again on another episode. But I want to leave you with this week's drag name. Attention, this is a special announcement. At the sound of the tone, your drag name will be Electrolux. Electrolux, because no one sucks like Electrolux. Bing bong. Thank you for listening to the Disaffected podcast. We're available on Spotify, iTunes, and anywhere that you get your podcasts. And if you like what you hear, please share with your friends and subscribe. This is one of the only podcasts you're going to find specifically talking about the relationship between abusive dynamics in families and abusive behaviors on the social justice left. It's content that you're not going to get anywhere else. Thank you.